Welcome back to the deep dive. All right, so for today's deep dive, you've brought some pretty fascinating stuff. A study from the Montreal Economic Institute, some recent news articles, all kind of circling around these two big proposed Canadian pipelines, Energy East and LNG Quebec.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff.
What I really want to get into is how these projects, had they gone ahead, could have really reshaped Canada's energy exports, especially given, our close relationship with the U.S. when it comes to trade.
Absolutely.
And by the end, I'm hoping we can kind of tease out what this whole story tells us about, how strong and adaptable Canada's economy really is.
For sure. And I think what really jumps out right off the bat from this MEI study is just how much Canada relies on one single customer for its crude oil. I mean, in 2023, 97% of our crude oil exports went to the U.S.
97%. That's incredible.
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
And the study makes the case that this isn't just some coincidence. It's actually a direct result of decisions that have basically stalled or blocked some major infrastructure projects.
Interesting.
And that leaves Canada in kind of a tricky spot, potentially vulnerable to shifts in U.S. policy. It limits our options when it comes to trade negotiations, and it makes it harder to access other global markets where we might get better prices.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's dive into the first big one here, the Energy East pipeline. This was a massive proposal, 4,500 kilometers long. The idea was to move crude oil all the way from Alberta to the Irving refinery in New Brunswick.
Yeah, huge project.
TransCanada, now TC Energy, put this forward in 2013, hoping to have it up and running by 2021. But as we know, it was scrapped in 2017. So what were the main roadblocks, the things that really killed it?
Well, the MEI study, it really points to just how complicated Canada's regulatory process is for these kind of mega projects.
I imagine.
You've got approvals needed from federal, provincial, sometimes even municipal governments. It can drag on forever.
Oh, for sure.
And then on top of that, you had a lot of pushback from environmental groups, raising totally valid concerns about, potential spills and the impact on sensitive ecosystems along the route. And the National Energy Board's review process itself, with its ever-changing rules and all the required consultations, it became a major obstacle in its own right.
It sounds like a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare, really.
Yeah, it's a tough landscape to navigate.
And it wasn't just opposition from outside, right? I mean, my understanding is that Energy East faced a lot of resistance from within Canada as well, particularly from Quebec.
You're absolutely right. That was crucial. The Quebec government never actually gave the project the thumbs up. And a big part of that, from what I gathered from the sources, was that Quebec didn't see enough direct economic benefit for the province itself. Plus, the pipeline's planned route involved going across several rivers, and naturally that created a lot of anxiety among Quebecers about the environmental risks.
Makes sense. Were there any specific concerns like the potential impact on the St. Lawrence that were really driving that opposition?
Oh yeah, those were front and center for sure. And as Adam Waterous, the chairman of Strathcona Resources, pointed out, it wasn't just about the pipeline itself. The refineries down in New Brunswick, they'd need substantial upgrades to actually handle the heavy crude oil coming from Alberta. Another layer of complication, another layer of cost.
So it was a whole bunch of things, really. A tough regulatory process, serious environmental worries, lack of support from Quebec, logistical headaches. It all added up. But this MEI study, they make it sound like a really big missed opportunity, a real shame. They figure Energy East, if it had gotten off the ground, could have shifted almost 28% of Canada's oil exports away from the U.S., sending 1.1 million barrels a day to Europe. That translates to, get this, $36.7 billion per year.
Yeah, it's a staggering number.
It is.
And if you tie that back to the bigger goal of diversifying our trade relationships, that kind of shift could have given Canada way more leverage on the global stage, made us more resilient, especially if you think about potential trade spats with our biggest trading partner. Imagine, like the MEI study suggests, if our export markets weren't so concentrated,
Right.
a trade war, a tariff war with the U.S. might have played out very differently. Beyond the dollars and cents, a stronger energy partnership with Europe could give in Canada a real boost geopolitically, opening up different diplomatic and economic alliances.
It really makes you wonder, what if? What could have been? Okay, so let's switch gears now and look at the other big project on the table, the LNG Quebec pipeline.
Sure.
This was a $14 billion proposal for a pipeline and a terminal up in the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region of Quebec. And unlike Energy East, this one was all about exporting natural gas. What was the thinking behind this one? What kind of impact could it have had? And why did it get blocked?
So, the idea with LNG Quebec was to tap into Canada's vast natural gas reserves and ship that gas in liquefied form to European markets.
Liquefied meaning.
Liquefied natural gas, LNG, is natural gas that's been supercooled into a liquid state.
Okay.
It's much easier and safer to transport that way. And with a proposed capacity of 46 million cubic meters per day, the MEI study suggests it could have shifted about 19% of our natural gas exports away from the U.S., amounting to something like $1.7 billion annually.
Got it.
But, much like Energy East, this one ran into a wall of environmental opposition. And in 2021, the Quebec government put a stop to it because of those concerns.
So yet again, we see environmental factors playing a decisive role in preventing Canada from branching out, diversifying its energy exports, this time in the natural gas sector. It is interesting to see, though, that public and political opinion seems to have shifted a bit, at least according to the polls you shared.
Oh yeah, it's been quite a turnaround.
What do you think is behind that change in sentiment, especially in Quebec?
What's really striking is that the polls now show a tremendous amount of support for both Energy East and LNG Quebec, and that includes within Quebec itself. It seems like there's a growing consensus across both the Liberal and Conservative parties that building pipelines is strategically important, especially when you consider potential trade friction with the U.S. It suggests that more people are recognizing the risks of having all our eggs in one basket when it comes to exports.
Right.
And this shift in opinion seems to be reflected in some pretty high-profile voices, too. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, for example, speaking at a conference over in India, even called for building an eastern pipeline immediately, to make sure Canada itself has a secure energy supply.
Oh,
Pretty strong words that really highlight the strategic value people are starting to see.
yeah. That's a bold statement. It really emphasizes how the global political landscape is changing and how that's making people more aware of the need for energy independence and having multiple supply routes. But we also need to be realistic, right? I mean, François Poirier, the CEO of TC Energy, he makes a really important point about the cost effectiveness of different export routes.
Yeah, for sure.
He said very clearly that expanding west is just inherently more cost effective than going east, simply because of the distances involved.
Yeah, the economics are hard to ignore.
His suggestion is that if we want to diversify our markets for both crude oil and natural gas, focusing on westward routes, tapping into those Asian markets, might be the more sensible way to go, economically speaking. Can you talk a bit about what's happening with our energy exports to Asia now and the infrastructure that supports those?
So while the volumes aren't nearly as large as what we send to the U.S., Canada does export some oil and gas to Asia, mainly by sending it through pipelines to the West Coast and then loading it onto tankers. We've got existing pipeline networks that connect Alberta's energy resources to the Pacific. And although pipeline capacity is always a factor, there are ongoing expansions and new projects in the works aimed at boosting our ability to reach those Asian markets. And from a pure dollars and cents perspective, those shorter distances mean lower transportation costs, which makes it pretty attractive for producers.
So looking back at everything we've discussed, it seems clear that those two proposed pipelines, Energy East and LNG Quebec, represented a big missed opportunity for Canada to lessen its dependence on the U.S. for energy exports.
Yeah, for sure.
Those projects ultimately failed because of a mix of things, from regulatory hurdles to environmental concerns. But now it seems like public and political opinion is shifting. People are starting to appreciate the strategic importance of infrastructure like that. But the economic realities, particularly the cost advantages of going west, make choosing the best path forward a really complex challenge.
And it highlights this tension, right, between these competing priorities.
Right.
On the one hand, there's this geopolitical push to diversify eastward for energy security, for access to other markets. And that argument seems to be gaining more traction now than it did, say, 10 years ago.
Right.
But on the other hand, the economic argument for prioritizing westward expansion, driven by those lower costs, it's still a really powerful consideration for both the industry and investors.
It all boils down to this central question, doesn't it? Considering all these factors, the economic push towards the West versus the potential geopolitical gains from diversifying eastward, what do you think is the most strategic path for Canada when it comes to shaping its energy future?
It's not a simple either or choice, right? There's
Yeah.
a whole web of risks and rewards to consider. Absolutely. And that brings up a really important question for you, the listener. As you think about Canada's energy independence and all the complexities of global trade, what role do you think big infrastructure projects like Energy East and LNG Quebec should play in shaping Canada's economic and political landscape in the years to come? It's a multifaceted issue, no easy answers, but understanding the potential impact of these past proposals can give us some valuable insights as we continue to grapple with these crucial questions.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up for today.
Good.
As always, a really stimulating conversation. Thanks for bringing such thought-provoking material to the deep dive.
My pleasure. Always enjoy it.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the issues that matter.
See you then.